Archbishop Charles Chaput admits the following, quote, "In reweaving the strands of beauty, goodness, and truth for the complex times we now share, James Matthew Wilson gives renewed life to the Christian intellectual vocation and feeds the nobility of the human soul," close quote. And eminent poet Dana Gioia cheers that the work of James Matthew Wilson is powerful and composed by an author who has completely mastered the tradition. James Matthew Wilson on poetry and his latest collection, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. James Matthew Wilson is the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature and the founding director of the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas. The author of 14 books, his most recent collection of poems is St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. The Strangeness of the Good won the Poetry Book of the Year Award from the Catholic Media Awards. The Dallas Institute of Humanities awarded him the Hyatt Prize in 2017. Memorial College gave him the Parnassus Prize in 2022, and the Conference on Christianity and Literature twice gave him the Lionel Basney Award. In addition to his role at the University of St. Thomas, James serves as a poet in residence of the Benedict XVI Institute, scholar in residence of Aquinas College, editor of Colosseum Books, and poetry editor of Modern Age magazine. James Matthew Wilson, welcome.
Todd, thanks for inviting me on here. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Segment 1. What is poetry? The prolific writer and poet G.K. Chesterton once admitted, quote, "What the world wants, what the world is waiting for, is not modern poetry or classical poetry or neoclassical poetry, but good poetry. And the dreadful, disreputable doubt which stirs in my own skeptical mind is doubt about whether it would really matter much what style a poet chose to write in any period, as long as he wrote good poetry." So, James, I want to lead off our conversation with asking you this fundamental question. Is Chesterton right? Are styles and seasons irrelevant? Is good poetry all that really matters?
Well, as people like to say, he's not wrong. Chesterton was himself a very talented poet, and what he was best at was the kind of rollicking ballad. He loved to capture the sort of the strong, almost marching music of a good poem. So the Ballad of the White Horse and Lepanto, those are the kinds of poems that if you have a big mind, you can memorize and recite, and everyone will be awestruck by the performance. And it's because Chesterton had a great ear for so many things, but including just the basic rhythm of the traditional ballad. But at the time he was writing those things, they were certainly anything but fashionable, and in fact, modern poetry was moving in a radical direction that very quickly would squelch and suffocate any aspect of song that it might have in it. So on the one hand, we have to be grateful to Chesterton that he stood athwart the tendency of the age and just wrote good poems that normal people can like. On the other hand, T.S. Eliot, who was very sympathetic to Chesterton on a lot of things, was pretty critical of Chesterton's approach to form. And so Eliot had his own weaknesses too in the opposite direction for sure. But one thing I think Eliot was right about is that the challenge for every artist in every age is to express the permanent, but to do so in a way that is under the shadow of the contemporary. So every age needs a new expression of eternal truths, and every age actually needs to reconfigure, however slightly, those lasting forms that make for great works of art. Modernism, that has turned so many people away from the arts, was a radical, secularizing, historicist mistake on the whole. But there's there's one dimension of modernism that's actually present in every age of the arts, going back to ancient Rome and even to ancient Greece, and that is that artists are always looking to simultaneously express great themes, lasting themes, permanent themes, but are also looking for new ways to do it so that we can come, as it were, with fresh eyes and re-encounter these things. And I do think that in his poetry, Chesterton did not always succeed in that respect.
Since you mentioned that, it's a question I was wondering. Do you think I love the notion you give primacy to the notion of the permanent truths that endure across time, and then the question is, what are the different ways we kind of can express this? What are the different forms that we can do that? Do you sometimes think that the motivation to find a novel form can sometimes overwhelm the intent to express the truth, so to speak? Is your sense that sometimes, style completely eclipses substance in the eyes of some poets, and that's where they go awry? Or would you say, generally speaking, sometimes the story is the form, it is the style, and so it's okay for it to have a larger role, even in expressing these permanent truths? What's your sense about that?
I am tempted to go along with that distinction of style trumping substance, but I would
Mm-hmm.
actually, I would probably maintain that, but push it even a little bit harder and say it's poets allowing themselves to be utterly tyrannized by history rather than being responsive to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the desire to express something in the current manner merely because it is the current manner
Right.
is a kind of servility that is really unbecoming any decent person, including an artist. Um, uh, Styles change and they're responding to the movements of history, but it's always done under the light of what's eternal. That's how we are as human beings. We're culture transcending creatures who live in a culture and form a culture. And so to ignore one or the other would be foolhardy. But on the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, uh, but we've learned the hard way that it's not always possible to draw those two things into a sort of incarnate union the way some of the great masters of the past have done. How do you? I got to phrase it this way recently. It sort of came out of my lips off the cuff, but I really latched onto it, and that's how do you create an art that's both rigorously traditional but also remorselessly contemporary?
Ooh.
Contemporary,
Ooh.
and and the first thing to say is just being tyrannized by history is not a good thing. We shape culture. We don't own culture, and we're part of culture. We don't possess culture. Culture is not a possession. It's something that occupies us rather than we it. Um, and and so we have a sort of responsive. We have to be we're being shaped by it, but we're also directing it in some ways and helping cultivate it like good farmers or gardeners. So learning to do that in a way that you're not merely tyrannized by history is one thing. But you said something else that I thought was really interesting, and that's
Hmm.
going back to that formulation of style to the exclusion of substance or something like that. The the
Yeah.
wonderful thing about the arts is that they remind us that the language of form, which goes back to the ancient world, to Plato and
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle, that form, as the ancients coined that term, refers to appearance or style or shape, but it also refers to the inner truth of things.
Hmm.
And certainly in our everyday life, we can make a distinction between form as shape and appearance and form as inner truth. There are
Mm-hmm.
plenty of people in the world, for example, who are really good looking, but they're awful on the inside, and we have to learn to make
Mm-hmm.
distinctions between appearance and reality. Uh, but fascinatingly, the artist has no such luxury. The style of the work of art is grafted, not grafted's the wrong word, is one with what's being expressed finally. And
Sure.
so the thing said can't be separated from the how of its saying.
Hmm.
And that's I found that to actually be one of the most um, valuable lessons as an artist, but also I think just as a human being, is learning to see the ways in which the shape of things, the form of things, the expression of things finally manifests the depths of the truth of things. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a challenge to do that thing, to test the inner truth of things by the rhetoric, you might say, of things.
Right.
But also it's been very gratifying, and I think that's what makes artistic work so rewarding is the challenge of bringing two things that could be separated, at least in principle, into one.
I love that neither one in the poetic mindset, neither one of those two aspects, form, substance, style, substance, what have you, can they're symbiotic. They can't quite survive alone. The sum is greater than its parts, and so one has to take into consideration that the enduring inner truth of a poem has to be made manifest, or like you said, the eternal tradition has to be made manifest in the style, and yet also the remorseless contemporary aspect of the style perhaps has to be still embodying the eternal truth, if you will. So I really love the fact that they're engrafted, and to parse out one is to potentially destroy both altogether. Is that fair to say?
I do think it's fair to say, and in fact, not only do I think it's fair to say, I think it's one of the great lessons that the arts have to offer people more generally. We
Yeah.
we live in an age, and this is going back 400 years now, alas, but we live in an age that's always trying to abstract and prescind, to reduce things to quantitative essences and or
Yes.
other easy simplified formulae. Uh, and the response to that is not simply to say that the world is complex, that it's more complex than any abstract numbers can capture. I mean, that may be
Mm-hmm.
true, but that's not the most compelling answer. The most compelling answer is that when you do that, you're simply betraying the fullness of reality. And so I think one of the lessons of the arts for how we know the world, how we know all things, is to recognize that we have to see the form of things. We have to take things whole. This is something I learned not from an artist originally, but from a theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, in his
Mm.
great book, The Glory of the Lord. Says we have to learn to see the form. And he called on Christians to learn to see the whole, say, of Scripture in the same way that they would look at the whole of a painting or
Hmm.
observe the whole of a poem, to genuinely contemplate the aesthetic form, the whole of it, not because he wanted to reduce Scripture to poetry, but
Yeah.
rather because poetry provided a good model, the arts provide a good model of what it really means to accept the full revelation of Scripture in
Hmm.
total, rather than
Hmm.
parsing it down to a few proof texts or a few convenient passages or a few abstract
Right.
credos.
Very good, very good. I love it whenever someone can bring in Balthazar, and this stuff is fantastic. Because we are interviewing or having a conversation with James Matthew Wilson, an eminent modern poet. What I wanted to do in this conversation is to integrate. We're going to punctuate each of our segments with a poem or two from your most recent release. The purpose of this podcast, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Bird. So what I like to do is, because the poetic voice is best from the poet who wrote the poem. James, if I may, I'd love to ask you right now to offer us, if you don't mind, and I can tell you the page it's on, maybe you know it by heart, The Wisdom of Old Men, a wonderful poem, page 39 in St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Would you mind just offering that to us, and then maybe a reflection on some of the origins of that work?
Yes, sure, I'd love to. So, uh, just since your listeners will be hearing this poem for the first time and they may not see it, it's a poem written in iambic pentameter. That's the poetic meter of Shakespeare, unrhymed, but in four-line stanzas or quatrains. Usually a quatrain is rhymed, but sometimes poets will write in meter and write in use the quatrain form, um, but without rhyme, and that's what I'm doing here. The wisdom of old men. Up north, in winter, at the snowy deer camp, the old men circled always near the fire, kept company with the crack of burning logs, their backs leaned in and smooth beneath plaid flannel. And what they were about, I do not know, who darted in and out with skis or sled, or tramped knee-deep through silent buried woods to follow deer tracks miles from the cabin. Their slowing bodies, cool and stiff, they may, with nothing left to do, have only sought the heat that sweated from the barrel stove, its blackened sides, its flickering mouth ajar. But even in my youth, I saw them there, as those charged with remembering days past, with pondering the clockwork of the world as gear on gear ground through their ordered circles. Those who descended to a place of freedom, where we may wonder at what has been made, as Nestor, old, among the furious Greeks, sat by and spoke above his warming hands.
Beautiful. Beautiful. James, tell us a little bit about how that poem came to be.
It remarkably, and you could rereading it today, I could only barely glean it, but the fourth of the 5 stanzas was originally going to begin as a translation of a psalm. I had just finished morning prayer and had in Magnificat and had read this particular psalm. I don't even remember the number of it off the top of my head that morning, and I thought this really speaks to some of the themes I've been working on in my poem. So I wanted to just put the psalm into verse, and then I realized very quickly, before I'd even written anything, that it was actually just a few lines that had particularly caught me on this morning, and erupting out of those verses of scripture, I suddenly saw the old men sitting by the barrel stove up at Camp Baldy in outside Greeley, Michigan, where I spent. It's a deer camp where I spent so many winters skiing and snowmobiling and losing in poker to my dad. And just so out of that psalm, which calls us to contemplate the great order of the cosmos, the workings of the world that God has made, I thought of the wonder of the world that I grew up in and still live in, and as a sort of sub-theme of this whole book, is my absolute love of snow. I just think snow is such a foretaste of heaven. If you know that great story by Isaac Dinesen, Babette's Feast, at the end of the story, the feasters who have been well satiated on this wonderful food that has become almost a sacramentalist communion itself. They go out into the snow and they're washed as innocent as lambs. And though I'm capable of a more cynical account of snow as well, that's the one that primarily governs my life. And also those weekends up north where there's no television, there was no television, at least in the many years I went up to the cabin, and where we would sit by the stove and talk to one another and tell stories, was so humanizing. And of course, as one of the small fry in the group, I was more listening to stories than anything else. And this is as much as things change, this is a perennial feature of human life. And so I wanted to end with, for whatever reason, one of my favorite aspects of Homer's Iliad, which is just the counsel of old Nestor, who's too old really to be fighting in the wars, to be fighting the Trojan War, and yet there he is, the first among equals, the wisest among the kings because of his age.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's what's wonderful. I love the archaeology of these because, like you said, it's spurred by a psalm in Magnificat during morning prayer, and it's evoking the memories of childhood gone by, and the warm memories and like you said, the deliciousness of snow. I'm from Minnesota, so any of you listening in the South right now. There is a deliciousness to snow, as James has said, not just frostbitten misery. And as a reader of this poem, if I can say, I look at this and I think of the Minnesota hunters, the deer hunters, or the duck hunters, or the kind of, or the campers, the Boundary Waters types, etc. And it just strikes me as it's going to be sort of just the men of the earth, the men of the outdoors, the outdoorsman type that are going to be having community, and there might be a drink and there might be a laugh and a smoke and all this. But I love as this poem unfolds, it unfolds in the institutional wisdom learned through grit and grime, and also through maybe vaulted ideas that came to common people. How amongst this group of people perennially gathering before the fire is wisdom, and for us to underestimate the guys in the orange hats and all that, or the hunters or what have you, as being below the station of great thought or, again, institutional wisdom is to misjudge. So again, that was my reading of it, but I love your archaeological dig on this. To hear that is wonderful.
That's you're reminding me of something. Just the page before is the title poem of the book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds.
Yeah.
And you can see why I put this poem right after, just from the very end of that poem. It's a poem about Aquinas reading both into scripture and into nature and seeing the signs of things that God has, as it were, built into the world to make the world intelligible to us, to make the world a place of instruction. And he speaks, and the end of the poem speaks of those myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth. And so I capture the raw youth and the old minds, and there was a little bit of an appeal back to Aristotle, who I think in the Ethics, he says, you can't teach young people philosophy, you can't teach young people ethics. They're too full of they're not only are they naive and in that sense empty, but they're also too full of energy and the desire for action. You have to reach a certain state of maturity and leisure to be really ready to receive all the things that the world has to teach you. And, as someone who's committed to helping young people discover the intellectual life, I wouldn't want to push that too hard, but it's certainly the case that one of the rewards of old age is the capacity to rest within wisdom and to contemplate it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. James, I want to ask you about, this seems like a grand question, but I just let your sense about this. How do you define a good poem? And are there some examples that, almost instantly Rorschach-like come to mind for you of a good poem from a good poet?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So let me take that in the order you asked it, because it's so easy to work through. It's easier to work through the abstractions and then get to the poems that taught me to think about these things. But even though it's perfectly reasonable just to cite some touchstones of great poems and then fall mute. So there are a few ways in which I've gone about thinking about this. I just gave a series of talks this summer on the book of Genesis and what it has to teach the artist and all of us about human life. And one of the first things is that we know that God transcends time because time is one of his creations, and yet the creation story unfolds in time. And we could ask, why would that be the case? And of course, the first and most obvious reason for us that it would be the case is that we understand things in terms of time. So if God was going to explain creation to us, it was going to have to unfold in terms that we could comprehend.
Sure.
So there's something about the unfolding drama of time that poems and all good works of art, but in a particular way, especially poems, are charged with capturing. And then, and we contemplate a bit further on in the second creation story. It's precisely because God has separated Eve from Adam that Adam can then cry out, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, that he can cry out he's been made whole. So there's something about us and about the nature of reality that wants plurality to make unity. The world, God doesn't just want simple unity. He wants plurality.
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of dramatic scope to that too, even though it's a drama of pure goodness at that moment. But then, of course, just a little bit on, it's only because Adam and Eve have become two that the tempter in the garden, the serpent in the garden, is able to seduce Eve and turn the two against one another. What I get from that is really kind of three lessons. On the one hand, just in terms of us, we need as creatures, we need to understand things in terms of the sort of dramatic unfolding in time. But then that second creation story tells us first that dramatic unfolding in time, that multiplicity, that unity made out of multiple parts, that complementarity, that's all good.
Yeah.
But amidst that good is always the possibility of evil and tragedy. And
Mm.
so much of tragedy is about things falling apart, things that were called to unity, being unable to sustain it. So among the things that great poems do is they place us into the center of that drama of multiplicity, seeking unity and
Mm.
sometimes failing in it. And in poetry, poets have a sort of license that, say, the novelist or the playwright seldom gets, and that is, it is possible to write a poem, you might say, of pure unity. That is to say, a doxology, a poem of pure praise for what
Mm.
is.
Mm.
But even that poem of pure praise will have some kind of dramatic element to it.
Right.
So that leads me to just a term that I got from the Catholic convert poet Alan Tate, who wrote this almost 100 years ago now that I think about it, that a good poem is going to represent tension. And it's not because all poems are ambivalent or they're getting their directions crossed or anything like that. It's because even when we're in the process of ascending to God, to that perfect wholeness of life with Him, even there's a hint of the human drama to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so works of art have to both represent that human drama and also the possibility of where they lead and what transcends them. So that's one way to put it. Another real quick way to put it is that a good poem, all poems, are acts of making that combine craft and inspiration, and that they work around three different lines that are completely interwoven with each other, that are inseparable. And that's the art of memory, calling things whole, the stuff that flies by us in time, calling them into a whole unity that which only the memory in us makes possible. Because history is fleeting, but because we have memory, we can gather
Mm.
the fruits of time, which are moments, into a stable whole that we can call a story. Metaphor. The most people think of poetry in terms of metaphor, and with good reason, because it's through figures of speech, broadly understood, schemes and tropes, all the uses of language, that things that couldn't be understood before suddenly become understandable. And then finally, and this is not the last, it's certainly, it might be the last in my listing, excuse me, but it's certainly not the least, and that is meter.
Mm.
The ordering of words according to meter, and by way of the use of rhyme also, is a way of giving form to language that makes it stable the way memory stabilizes time. And also, it makes it a little order, a little cosmos of order that's reflective of the macrocosmic order of all that God has made. And so, making memory, metaphor, and meter is another way of defining what makes a poem. And
Mm.
poems that do those things well, that are
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
made, that those make good poems. So just let me. I'm going on so long
This
here.
is no. This is wonderful. It's wonderful.
Let me give you just a few poems that do this uh, especially well. By W.B. Yeats, A Prayer for My Daughter, where
Mm.
he looks with fear upon his daughter and wishes her to become a source of order in the world, but also recognizes, thinking back to Helen of Troy and the Iliad, the great dangers that are posed to a girl who is in her beauty.
Yeah.
That's a marvelous poem, and Yeats
Mm.
has so many wonderful poems. That's one of the greatest of them. Um, uh, Probably one of the great achievements in the lyric poem uh, of the golden age of English poetry, which is the late 16th and early 17th century, is the poet John Donne's uh, Good Friday 1613 Riding Westward,
Okay.
which is just about the most perfect poem in the English language.
Mm.
And it's a poem that uh, uh, merits exploration for Christians in particular, because it's a poem that unfolds according to the tripartite understanding of the human being um, as imago Dei,
Mm-hmm.
as Augustine articulated it. I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned memory a moment ago. I'm going to mention it again. Augustine tells us that the human essence that makes us images of God is that we are one soul, one mind, but with memory, understanding, and will. as this sort of these Trinitarian acts of our unity. And that's an expression of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, that discovery of Augustine has a long history of informing the anthropology of the Christian faith, how we understand human beings, what we understand humans to be. And it informed in the 16th and 15th, 16th, 17th century how prayer was enjoined. So, for example, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola depends on the act of memory, the act of understanding, and the act of will for the performance of those spiritual exercises. This was not lost on the poets. In fact, John Donne was the dean of St. Paul's. He was in London. He was an Anglican priest, and he loved St. Augustine, perhaps above all of the church fathers. And so we see in that poem, a poem unfolding where we start in the memory and move to the understanding into the will. It's so amazing because it's such a good poem in itself, in its heroic couplets. And yet it would be a poem that would be impossible to write if it weren't for the essential insights into what it means to be human that come to us through the church and from the church fathers, especially in this case, Augustine. I'll mention a more or less contemporary poem.
Sure.
One of my favorite poems is by the recently deceased poet Richard Wilbur. He lived to the age of 96. Richard Wilbur, as he was approaching the 50th wedding anniversary to his wife, with his wife Charlie, he wrote a poem called For C, for his wife. And that's a poem in sesta rima, a beautiful form, about the tumult of young lovers. And he says to his wife, "We are denied, my dear," these wild ecstasies of one night stands and a single dance on the dance floor. But then he turns in that final stanza to describe what they do have. And of course, it's a love that's as lasting and enduring and as well made as a fiddle, as a violin, as a rose window in a cathedral, or as the firmament. He ends. Wow. A beautiful testimony to what genuine love looks like, as opposed to the somewhat impassioned flashes of so many of our youths. I should just give you one more, because the one chance I have to offer offer readers some good things to look at. I'll mention this one. Philip Larkin, who was born just a few years before Wilbur, though died much sooner and back in the 1980s, was the most beloved poet of the 20th century in England. Philip Larkin had many good poems, though he didn't write that many poems overall. And one of them is The Whitsun Weddings, which is just about a man on a train heading to the countryside for the weekend, but in Whitsuntide, springtime, when young men and women are coming together and getting married. And as he rides on the train, he notices one station, then another, a wedding party, bidding their final farewells to in-laws and guests, and hopping on the train to go on their honeymoons. And it's a beautiful testimony to a fellow who feels as if he's alone in the universe. And then he realizes, station by station, that in fact there are enduring traditions, cultural forms that shape our lives and that draw us together into something much greater than any of us is alone. In this case, a nation, but there are other works of art, of course, that speak to us as the unity of us as a church.
Wow. Amazing. I mean, I could sit and listen to you for an hour, just because I think it's fascinating. On this note, I listened to you, James, and what you speak about, whether it be St. Augustine or Larkin or Donne or I'm trying to remember your first one that you had mentioned.
Richard Wilbur and
Richard
Yates.
Richard Wilbur, yeah, and Yates. So the apprehension or the comprehension of human nature and human nature vis-a-vis the larger transcendent aspects of what it means to live in a universe with a loving God. I mean, just this dramatic body, mind, spirit, God and the Trinity, man and woman on the gritty earth, and all this drama that flows in between. All these poets, to my way of thinking, as you've just described it so well, are discerning aspects of those relationships, and they comport with people's experiences, they comport with people's longings, they comport with people's appreciations, their growths, and so on. It's sort of like someone says something and someone says, now that's the way to say it. Now you put your finger on something there. There's a truth that is alighting upon a person that writes these kind of poems and then transmits to the rest of us, and so on. And my next question that I was going to move into was the notion of bad poetry. And that is that it strikes me that there is a counter narrative. It's either sloppy or just provocative for the sake of provocative or whatever. But it seems to be a little bit more than that. It's a deconstructing of the narratives you just described. So you have this beautiful series of poems you just highlighted. You have this Imago Dei, the memory, understanding, will, as Augustine has described, and so on. What are the poets that you find distasteful, if not reprehensible? What are they doing to those narratives? How are they bastardizing, deconstructing, destroying? And then I'd say, what is that? What's the impact of that in a culture? Is it a nuisance? Don't read it, big deal, or is it a menace that gets kind of into the floorboards and into the behind the sheetrock and rots the edifice? What's your sense about that?
Oh,
So sorry, that was a big question. But
oh, it's a good question. I published a book, almost 10 years ago now, called "The Fortunes of Poetry in an Age of Unmaking," which is now in a beautiful second edition hardcover. And part of the ambition there, in the first half of the book, anyhow, actually more like the first 3/4 of the book, was just to diagnose what had gone wrong. And the thing is, so much had gone wrong. So if I could just list things off sort of at random, I think the first thing that went wrong, has gone wrong in the arts, and this is in poetry as well as many of the arts. The first thing that went wrong was the effort to wrench apart what we might call the popular and the high. All the arts, from Homer to Shakespeare and on to the great novelists of the 19th and early 20th century, they all understood that a work of art needs to be comprehensible immediately,
Yeah.
and that if the work is to be profound and difficult, it has to be profound and difficult behind the surface of it. A good poem will be superficially appealing, and it'll be superficially appealing precisely because you'll hear it and say, I don't know what that means, but it sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
And of course, it's all but impossible to make something sound really good if it hasn't been understood, if it's not metrical, if it's not ordered and given a musical form, if it's not voice restored to its origins in both noble rhetoric and in music and song. So that's one thing. A subsequent one was the loss for many artists of a sense that that there was anything in the world that was permanent enough to require expression and newfound expression. And so in principle, that could have just led to a bunch of nihilistic artists. And we get some of those in the 19th century, the poet Lepardi, Mallarmé, etc. But they're actually kind of good poets.
Yeah.
Where people become really bad poets is when they violate their own human nature. And here's what I mean by this. It's all well and good to say there's nothing transcendent and permanent that requires expression, but you don't actually believe that. Nobody does. Our minds are ordered to the truth with a capital T, and I don't just mean we have a religious call to God, though that's certainly what I mean. I mean that our everyday thought is always moving from the particular to the universal and back from the universal to the particular. And we know that to know anything at all is to know that which is outside of time and to know that which is in time under the sign of what's eternal. So that's built into our thought. And so what happens for some of the interesting poets of the 19th century who sort of flirted with despair, who flirted with nihilism, is they leave themselves stuck in that crux, and we get often brilliant works of art that are existential, that are confronting the human person in his confused state and trying to work through it, even if they don't reach conclusions that I would find very compelling. This would be, a great example of a compelling conclusion would be, say, Tolstoy's short novella or novelette, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is just one of the greatest probings of the human psyche in all of our literature, and especially in such a short book. Where things go wrong is when an artist claims not only that there's nothing transcendent worth expressing, but then unable to deny his own human nature, which craves what is permanent and everlasting, he takes that desire, which is a desire for God, and perverts it, diverts the stream to something that's greater than him, but not genuinely transcendent. And down to the instance, almost always, this is just people perverting art to serve a political ideology.
Right.
Almost without exception. Whether it's identity politics or whether it's the latest cause, this is the thing that this is the great temptation of contemporary artists and poets that has soured our cultural life immensely. Not only because they're the worst causes, but because it's such an abuse of the great responsibility of the artist to express being, to express reality in its fullness, and they cramp reality. They confine it to a bread box sized contraption that's one or another political cause. And I mean, you can't help but just look away. You look away the way.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, we do have to just look away. We just have to build good new things, and let the rotten rot. So, there's, you just got to think about our medieval ancestors. Who cares what's going on in the city over there? I've got a monastery to build. That's what we have to do. Build a monastery. On the other hand, I love that idea of the mold getting behind the drywall. Not only because it's painfully hits home with various home disasters over the years, but man, it's certainly the case that you can try to ignore the stuff, but the rot doesn't go away. It festers. It's one of the lessons of Shakespeare's King Lear, is that the reality of evil is no proof of the good. So the reality of evil is proof that, in a sense, it is the proof of the good. But as Albany puts it, that evil tends to eat its own, and that's not his expression. I'm ruining Shakespeare if anybody thinks that's Shakespeare, but but that evil tends to devour itself and feast upon its rivals, which are also evil. And so you can't just let evil sit by, which is why I wrote that book years ago. Somebody just needed to call out all of these charlatans who were rooting an art form I love and just say, call a spade a spade. I got some wonderful hate mail for that book from some of the...
You must have done something right.
Yes, I know. Well, how would I put it in response to one email? Being a charlatan hack poet will only take you so far, like to an endowed chair at the University of Pennsylvania. That's the way I usually put it. So, so you do have to call those things out. And although because people are going to say, wait, there's all this stuff that's called poetry now.
Yeah.
And you have to explain to people, well, things went wrong, and it's possible to restore them. So we have to make the criticism, and then we have to get back to restoring good things.
It's I love the way you've said that. One of the things I think about in the modern era of, ideology has been with us forever. It's just been on steroids for the last 120 years or since the French Revolution, frankly. But what's interesting to me is there's in orthodoxy, Chesterton talks about kind of the small cramped room of one idea. The kind of the man who's a rationalist who can't see beyond the four walls of his own perceptions, his own analysis, his own rationalization. He can't see to this large, expansive world that involves God, but also involves mystery and the inexplicable and the miraculous, and so on and so forth. And it strikes me that the nihilism in some of these bad poems. First of all, I agree. It seems to me that yes, those of us who are less well versed in, no pun intended, in good poetry, sometimes as things come along and all the critics are hailing this, it's nice to have someone who has some background and say, let me explain where the rot is in this, where the deviation is in this, where the attack on the transcendent is in this that you may not necessarily be seeing. The other thing I'll say is I have started to believe more and more that as ideologies fail, they do devolve to decadence. And as decadence consumes people, they find themselves at the edge of the abyss and they look over. And I think a lot of people start turning away from it. I think the point is the work that you're describing, the work that you're producing, the work that you're celebrating, it provides that transcendent, finger wave, come over here or come this way to those who've been to the abyss and are repelled by it and are now suddenly going to give that transcendental thing, that transcendent thing, a second look and a new look and perhaps now a converted look, so to speak. So my question is, do you think that in the abyss of bad poetry, in the deconstruction of the narratives as you've described from Augustine and Yeats and Wilbur and so on, is there hope? Is there hope that even the bad stuff out there for the person that's uneducated but gets that bad feeling about things the more they spend time with it? Do you have this feeling that there is still an inner sense to pull away from the abyss and find their way back to these transcendent things? What do you think about that?
The great challenge is people will pull away from the abyss, but they often they'll be like the dwarves in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle. Having been burned once, they don't want to be burned again, and so they become inured to wonder.
Yeah,
or they become suspicious. Since we wanted to read some poems, this seems like an opportune time to talk about the sonnet that you mentioned earlier, For Martha.
Yeah.
This is a poem that I was just critiquing a certain kind of didacticism, the perversion of this call to the permanent things of the arts into politics, and especially a very small, cramped, smelly kind of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a poem that was inspired, first of all, by the 16th century priest, Jesuit, poet, and martyr Thomas Southwell, who's most famous for his poem, The Burning Babe. But my favorite poem of his is one called Look Home. And I had just recited that poem to some of my students, and I thought I want to just honor Southwell by doing a contemporary version of that poem.
Hmm.
So this is a poem called For Martha, which is, of course, Mary and Martha. Mary's the contemplative one. Martha's busy with many things, and so this is for Martha, for that Martha, not my Aunt Martha or anything like that. And it's a sonnet for Martha. Busy with many things, I know you are, and watch you turn away and close the door. I see it in the way you drive your car, in how things clutter on your kitchen floor. Someone will advertise new ways to mend it, to find a method and a discipline. But you and they both know you'll never end it, just fall for schemes to get rich or grow thin. Even so, beneath the stirrings of your heart, there lies some memory of peace and stillness, an image uncontrived by human art that makes this life seem one persistent illness. Turn inward, then, just as those teachers say, who make of silence words by which to pray.
Beautiful. And then we're going to go to our second segment. I wrote right away, and this doesn't take rocket science to say this, but on busyness, this strikes me particularly, like many of us, in the fight for inner peace, the urgency to get all the things done, to be the Marthas of the modern world, and to sort of either disdain the Marys that sit at Christ's feet, or to be envious of it and think, well, I'll get there, but I'll get there by this industrious path. And so it very much so. It very much hits close to home. How did you feel writing this? Is there part of you? I've asked this of a poet before. Are some of these poems for you, or are all of them for you? Are they for an audience? Are they for God? I mean, how does one characterize this poem in particular? Are you writing this for you? Yes, to the poet you mentioned before that inspired it, but is there some message to you in this as well?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So, um, I mean, my poems in general, I can't, I can try, but I can't fully communicate the the s- the pure blood shaking exhilaration that occurs in just making a new thing.
Mm,
And it's not any new thing. You know, I could make some waffles and I might be a little bit proud of them,
yeah.
but make, and I, I've written I write a lot of prose. I write essays and reviews and books and prose, and I take great satisfaction in those. But there is nothing that satisfies like writing a poem. And it's mostly the clicking of the meter. It's the getting the words into place and to hear how that iambic movement will link language together.
Mm,
It's a different level of crafting than anything else that I can think of. And so it's so satisfying, and it's a satisfaction for its own end. And I know it's a satisfaction for its own end because I could write a poem that I know is not my best poem. That is to say, it might be on a minor subject, might not be all that important. But when I see that it's the best poem that it can be, when it's
yeah.
made the right way,
Yeah.
I rest content with it, and
Yeah.
I'm so grateful. I mean, I'm almost as grateful for it as I would be for the big hits when I know I've really struck gold.
Mm, mm,
Um, um, this poem has a particular, very subjective, satisfying quality to it because as I said, had just been recited some Robert Soffel to uh, to my Master of Fine Arts students. In fact, this was during the opening ceremony for the Master of Fine Arts program at the University of St. Thomas. And so it was the very beginning of things. But this was also the very first poem I wrote sitting in this room from which I'm talking to you
mm.
after I moved home to Michigan. And so this was the moment when the moving boxes were just about empty enough that I could sit down and give myself pause for thought.
Oh, I love it. Segment 2, The Poet's Craft. In an interview with Matthew Sawtell, James Matthew Wilson explained his pattern of composing poetry, saying the following, quote, T.S. Eliot made many fine observations about the life of poetry. One is his definition of the major poet as a poet who continuously develops chapter after chapter over the course of his career. Each book must be a new setting out in a new direction. My routine, Wilson continued, in thinking about poems naturally, attempts something of the kind. If I write a poem on one subject, I know the next poem will be on something very different. If I write blank verse for a while, the next poem or poems must be in rhyme. I veer from long lines to short, from rhetoric to music, trying to make each poem achieve something I have not done before, and perhaps something I didn't think was possible, close quote. So, James, do you still feel the same way in terms of your rhythm of the way you write poetry? And I also want you to maybe follow up with that, to hearken back and ask, what was your first draw to poetry?
uh, oh gosh, that's a I really want to make sure I get that question right because it's
Right.
one that really interests me. The first draw part I can probably start with though, and that was so I started writing young as
Mm-hmm.
writing fiction and essays, and that was my interest until one day during my sophomore year at the University of Michigan, Professor Lawrence Goldstein said that phrase that everybody knows but nobody knows what it means, iambic pentameter,
Mm-hmm.
and he started to explain what it meant. ba 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 ba. And I thought, wait, how does that work? I've been reading Shakespeare since I was, read Romeo and Juliet freshman year of high school. How does this work? So I sat there trying to write a line, and I came up with a sonnet every day for 5 long years.
Oh my gosh.
And it took forever to write that lousy line,
Yeah.
and who knows what else Professor Goldstein was teaching that day. He might have changed the world with his teachings, but I didn't hear it. I was busy writing that line. And I took that line home, went to dinner with my classmates, and I said, "Look at this line that I wrote. That's iambic pentameter." I'm sure I said. I went up to my room and wrote 13 more lines, and I had a sonnet. It took about 5 hours. I came home the next night, wrote another sonnet, 5 hours. Did it for 5 nights. Each time it was a slow, tedious grind, but at the end of each time, I had that same experience I described to you a few minutes ago, where I just said, this is the kind of making where you feel something new coming into being, and you just want to let it be in the world.
Wow.
And take on its own existence, and just stand back and be grateful. And so it was a number of years before I said, it took a number of really crises for me to get to the point where I said, I want to make sure I can do that all the time, and not have to worry about anything else, about my artistic integrity or anything like that. So I said, I'll become a poet, because nobody makes a living as a poet. So I'll do something else. And that way I'll always be doing it for the right reason, because there's no other reason than this joy of making to be a poet. If I was a plumber, I'd be a much wealthier man today. But what you described in that, or what I described in that quotation of the interview, is so true. And this goes back to what we started with early. The how you say something is intrinsically linked to what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So learning to find expression for something, even something that you've already thought of, will actually teach you something new about what you thought. There's that wonderful aphorism from an essay in criticism by Alexander Pope. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. And that's beautiful. Wit takes the common knowledge of mankind, what oft was thought, and gives it a new expression that it lacked before. But the thing that line of Pope doesn't get is that when you express something, you reveal new truths about it. That's why metaphors are so helpful to us. Metaphors are not mere illustrations. They take us deeper into the mystery that's around us and show us the interior of it in a way that we couldn't have otherwise seen or imagined or known. And so what I was describing in that quotation you shared, it was in part just the challenge of finding new forms. If I write ballad measures, or a poem in a ballad measure, or a short quatrain, one day I want to be doing something with a longer line. The next, if I'm writing in blank verse for a while, I want to make sure I go back and do rhymes. And part of that's just a craftsman's trying to do good work and get better. But it's also about trying to uncover new aspects of reality that it's already there. People don't make anything. We don't create anything. We just uncover things. But to try to do it and to use the poetic techniques to discover things. I don't think this story will take too long to tell, even though it's
no, tell it.
It could, but this is especially the case. This has been especially the case. This effort to strain towards something new by way of craft, but to enter onto reality in a new way. In my more directly religious poems, I have lots of poems in my first book that are in some way directly or indirectly touching on the questions of God and the divine and the religious life, the Christian life, and I including from early on, I had written a couple Advent poems. I'll come back to those in just a second.
Sure.
So I decided, I want to say around, I think it would have been 2012 or so. I wanted to write a Stations of the Cross. There was a poetic Stations of the Cross I had read by the Irish poet Dennis Devlin, some of which was really good, some of which was really bad. And I thought I always wanted to. I'd like to do what he did. So I chose the Stabat Mater stanza and wrote a Stations of the Cross. Took me a couple summers to do this. Just one poem for each of the stations, and I was thrilled to have written it. But I also noted as I finished the 14th station, I said, I did not achieve something genuinely new. That is to say, everything that was in those poems was something that I kind of knew myself capable of achieving
Sure.
as a writer before that. I was straining and I didn't break through to what I was straining towards. I could still feel I was within my previous arm's reach.
Yeah.
But it had set me on a path. So then I went back to those early pair of Advent poems I'd written, and I wrote a sequence for Christmas called the Christmas Preface. It has 6 poems. They're now in the second edition of my first book. They're the last 6 poems of the book. They have their own section, the Christmas Preface. And there, especially when I got to the Feast of the Nativity, I thought, now I know what I was straining towards. I was trying to write a complete poem of praise that was just a truly metaphysical positioning of the self, just standing before God as being itself and the source of all being, and offering a prayer that was not pleading and petitionary, but simply doxological.
Sure.
And I realized that if I hadn't written the Stations of the Cross, I never would have gotten to finish that sequence. And it was a sequence I had sort of planned out from very early on, but it stalled. So I only had the first 2 installments.
Yeah.
Right. And I wouldn't have thought that. I thought that, okay, now I've done it. Now I've written a religious poem. But little did I know that actually, right after I finished the Feast of the Nativity, the last of those Christmas preface poems, the Benedict XVI Institute asked me to write a poem commemorating Frank LaRocca's The Mass of the Americas, the commission mass that Archbishop Cordileone celebrated in St. Mary's Cathedral in 2018. And after with that commission, and after hearing the Mass, I went home and wrote a book-length poem called The River of the Immaculate Conception, which is an account of Catholicism's place and doings on this continent, in the Americas, I should say. And that was a total, complete breakthrough in the sense that I didn't know I was capable of doing any of the things that I did in that book until I did them. And so I've always thought that there was sort of a pilgrimage. I had my Inferno in the Stations of the Cross, my Purgatory in Christmas, and then I had pure paradise when I wrote that poem.
That's an amazing story. I mean, it's an amazing story. I mean, this is the old, for me to oversimplify it, but faith means believing in advance would only make sense in reverse. You didn't recognize if there were struggles, when there were struggles, where this was going, how it was to be expressed, how this would, kind of mold and sculpt you for the ultimate work you did, all of it being good along the way and so on. But that's an extraordinary story. It's an extraordinary story. And that tells a lot about the path of a poet. So I think it's extraordinary. There's a famous excerpt from a letter that Robert Frost wrote to Louis Untermeyer back in 1916. He said, "A poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. It is a reaching out towards expression and effort to find fulfillment. A complete poem is one where an emotion finds the thought and the thought finds the words." Does this resonate with you, or would you disagree with that?
Oh, would anybody dare disagree with Robert Frost? I only disagree with it in one respect, and that is, happily, I don't have to know where poems begin, and they don't always begin in the same place.
Sure.
And it's amazing how the testimony across the tradition is, and much less my own experience, is so varied on this that you never know where a poem's going to come from. Sometimes it's an idea. Sometimes it's a thought that's seeking a feeling. Sometimes it's a sound that's seeking a thought. Sometimes it's a feeling. I always think of the great epic poem, science fiction epic poem by Frederick Turner called Genesis, which is a poem that's about the settlement of Mars. And it's a poem that's so rigorous in its knowledge of the scientific detail of what would be involved in creating a settlement on Mars, that every NASA astronaut who goes to the Space Academy has to read this poem, because it's easier to just have them read the epic poem than many articles.
Wow.
It's that informative.
Wow.
That poem for Fred began with a sound in his head, and nothing else.
Wow.
And I've had that experience so many times where, I wrote a book-length poem called Quarantine Notebook, which is about the first 2 months of the pandemic, and it's a long poem in blank verse. It started with nothing else other than the desire to make a line of iambic pentameter. And then it emerged into, I was writing the news in verse for 2 months. These were all being published as the pandemic was first unfolding. That was a huge artistic breakthrough for me. And it began with a sound. It began with a rhythm. It began with just the desire of the hand to move the pen across the page and to make something sound like something.
So good. So good. James, would you do? Let's dive into another one of your poems, if possible. This one's just a titch longer, but it's a lovely poem. It's Sloth, page 67. Would you mind just walking us through that one?
Sure. So I won't say too much about this. Sloth has an epigraph from one of my favorite philosophers, and I hope many of your listeners, Josef Pieper, the great German Catholic philosopher who loved St. Thomas and Martin Heidegger and brought them together in funny ways. And this is a quotation from his Leisure, the Basis of Culture. The notion of achadia means that a man does not, in the last resort, give the consent of his will to his own being, that beneath the dynamic activity of his existence, he is still not at one with himself. So here's the poem Sloth, which is the English translation of achadia. When autumn came, my grandfather set up behind a metal desk in his garage with slender ball-peen hammer and curved pick to hull and crack the acrid mound of dusty, bruised, green husks that each held in its core a small black walnut. He'd gather them each year while raking leaves and bring them here. Other men I have known had other passions, to sell insurance or run clothing stores, to coach a squad of boys to pitch and hit in summer league. And we are so impressed by excellence, by concentration, how it shuts the world out and brushes off distraction with a rudeness quite accidental, that some have thought that this was our vocation, the answer to the question why we're here, and whose unceasing cultivation is our happiness. But even as a boy, when I would see, stowed in my idle laziness, the girls solicitous of every teacher's praise, those busy bodies who volunteered to cook hot meals for old folks, to tutor after school, or paint bright signs for Spirit Week, I'd sense their flitting ache of restlessness. And though I felt rebuked by their goodwill, and knew my brooding silence in the lunchroom was also discontent, if not distraction, and marked for shame, I nonetheless thought they had fled the question posed by themselves, or pushed it off beyond tomorrow with assurance that they had done what was asked. And later, when I saw what Pascal wrote about the king possessed of everything, who would not have himself be left to sit in solitude, for fear his roving mind's eye might return upon the glowering emptiness within, and there, cut off from glittering abundance, find gnawing misery, I knew that man, contemptible and great, could build a far-flung empery from worry, an earnest moral sentence from a lie he tells himself, and knew reflective anguish in being thought resembled more than humming outward deeds what deed and thought both parody, that peace we fear to seek. For it is silly, Aristotle says, to think the gods live their eternity fiddling about with war or sex or money. They are all stillness. No less must we, who crack our meat from shells and earn commissions sweating at the office, set by our deeds at last for that pure act of godlike rest.
It's extraordinary. So good. And you're leading with Joseph Pieper's quote. I remember reading what "The Leisure, the Basis of Culture," and the whole notion that so many things we're enterprising upon every single day um, papers over the true quest, which is to be to be in contemplation, to be in prayer, to be in the richness of the simplest of the virtues, the simplicity of love, and so on. There's a little bit of For Martha that I caught up. You can see, obviously, there's some of these that are leaping out to me because they speak to a certain station of my life right
Yes.
now.
Yeah.
You know, your sense. This is so supremely diagnostic of the human retreat from interiority and into the arms of industry at all costs. Is that something that haunts? I mean, is that a haunting part for humankind that we'll struggle with till the day we die? Or are we ever going to get wise about that? What's your sense about that?
Yeah. It's always been a human temptation to think that life has as its end action,
Yeah.
being productive and fruitful and doing things. And that's partly right because life is an activity.
Yeah.
But so often we try to compensate for the emptiness within us by trying to prove to ourselves or to others that we're useful.
Hmm.
And we try to, as Pascal put it, we try to divert ourselves from the turning inward to turning into that place where our intellect dwells and where it can arrive at a knowledge of the truth. We try to turn away from that and keep ourselves busy with myriad occupations. And I I that's as old as the warrior society of ancient Athens, which
Mhm.
said, "No, true glory is death on the battlefield." And then Aristotle said, "Well, you know what? If you think about God, then your glory will be in your mind. Wouldn't that
Yeah.
be better than having it, you know,
Yeah.
radiating from your dead body?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and and so we always have to remind ourselves of that. Of course, you know, in our age, on the one hand, people are more restless than ever. They've even turned the intellectual life into a horrifying parody of the work life.
Hmm.
Think of the racing through images on screens is never contemplative. It's in fact, you could feel if you're looking at the news online, you can feel the abyss in you calling
Yeah.
out, saying, "I'm hungry for something that will fill me." Um, and so you go from news article or random thing to random thing, or I suppose even worse now is TikTok video to TikTok video, all these things
Mhm. Mhm.
that people use to fill up their soul,
Yeah.
not just their days, but their souls, and of course it
Yes.
trickles right out of the soul. You can't fill it. So there's always a temptation. I want to say for all your listeners, I don't generally write poems primarily about me. And when I do, I always make stuff up. Um, because a poem is a work of fiction, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel no obligation to talk about the true James Matthew Wilson in a poem. But the true James Matthew Wilson teenage edition is sort of the back of that poem, Sloth. My temptation was never hyperactivity. I was a pretty thoughtful kid, but like most teenagers, I was a thoughtful, angsty kind of kid.
Yeah.
And so would sit back and look cynically at all the girls in honor society making banners for Spirit Week, etc. And at one point I beat myself up about that because I really admire all those people who do so much good in the world,
Yeah.
and I try to imitate them in my really bad way as best I can. Um, and people for whom it just comes naturally to go out of themselves and into the world, either in service of another person or even just to play a good game of golf.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
the pure joy of playing catch with my kids is one of
Yeah.
my the great pleasures of my middle age. So in this poem, one of the things I thought I'd sort of work through dialectically is, on the one hand, there's a kind of evasiveness to that, though, too, because I can remember looking on those girls and thinking, do you ever sit back and think about your soul? Do you ever think
Mm,
about what you're here for, or are you too busy
mm,
making this banner? So much of that seems so superficial, and I think in some ways it was superficial, even if it was good. Um, then I looked with a little more forgiving eye on Mr. Angsty Wilson in his teenage years, and just thought, yeah, that's not so great either. But the one thing to be said for it is, at least in my restless stillness, thoughtfulness, at
yeah.
least I was anticipating um, the the greater thoughtfulness of prayer, and and our destinies, which is to know God and to stand before Him in contemplation, not to that's our final destiny. There will be no Marthas in heaven, because Martha will be in heaven, but she will no
Yeah.
longer be doing the dishes.
Yeah, so true. So true. Say, James, before we move to our final segment, I want to ask you, as the founding director of the MFA in creative writing program at the University of St. Thomas, how do you teach people a poetic sensibility and pass on the poetic craft?
It's I guess the way you pass on any craft, first of all, that you teach them the tradition and the
Yeah.
techniques.
Yeah.
And for real poetry, there is a tradition and techniques. It's not the off the cuff formlessness that so much contemporary poetry composes. Not the real thing. And you do that for a couple of reasons. I mean, the one nice thing is that even if you're not a really talented individual, if you learn the basics of the craft, you can still make something pretty good. And
Hmm.
by pretty good, I mean things that would be worthy of publishing in a magazine, or in a book. That's that is You can make a decent poem that's just well crafted, even if it's
Yes.
not phenomenal and not doesn't show deep inspiration. Um, and so so there's a lot that can be taught, but it has to be taught in the apprentice mode, which is why in creative writing programs we call the course where the students are working on their poems with us, we call it a workshop,
Hmm.
because they are being given models, and they are being asked to learn from those models and to make new things, drinking deep of the tradition that has made the English poetic tradition the articulate instrument that it is.
Sure.
And that's really all you can do. There are some people who just won't ever have that more mysterious element that's inspiration, or that goes under the term inspiration. Um, uh, but um, but I have to say, a lot of the time, if you just trust the craft, you trust the tradition, inspiration also comes,
Yeah.
because the mere movement of your body, the making of the syllables into verses, tends to uh, unsettle places that you might not even be aware of, and to bring new things into one's consciousness, or into the work, at least. I think there's so much you can impart to
Mm.
aspiring writers. I'll say this much. We want to teach them the tradition of their craft, and we want to teach them the techniques of their craft. We want them to know the Catholic literary tradition, to see the ways in which artists of recent times have tried to bring the reality of the divine into the presence of this world in a way that even those who are hard of hearing can hear.
Yes.
And then also, our church is you can't really be a true Catholic artist if you don't know your philosophy and theology, especially the
Mm.
philosophy and theology of beauty. So we want all of our students to know the church's teaching on that, and to understand why beauty matters, why works of art are capable of changing a life. You don't have to know those things to be a good artist, but I think it will make you a better artist. And so we teach our students that too.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. In the opening pages of St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds by James Matthew Wilson, Brad Berzer writes, quote, "Of our living poets, to my mind, no greater one exists than James Matthew Wilson," close quote. Dana Gioia notes, quote, "James Matthew Wilson is the most conspicuously talented young poet critic in American Catholic letters," close quote. And finally, some Yahoo named Todd Warner observed, quote, "James Matthew Wilson is a treasure. Without making demands, his sublime poetry beckons us softly to remember who we are, children of God in a miraculous world. In a harried age of forever becoming, Wilson's words invite us to rest a while in the healing moments of simply being. That's quite a balm for a reeling, uncertain world," close quote. James, you've earned this. You've earned the accolades, and it's your work and your discernment of why this work matters in the poetic tradition, especially informed by the Catholic faith, matters. It's extraordinary. So, what I want to ask you specifically about St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, before we go into one last poem, is that this is a collection of your poems from across time and published in many different locations. I think it was ranging from First Things to the Hudson Review, the National Review, the New Criterion, America, even our very own Evangelization and Culture. Your exploration in this work, again, Ambition and Sloth, A Wedding Night, and Your Son's First Poem, Russell Kirk, The Death of Cicero, just a wide variety. So notwithstanding these poems being drawn from disparate places, are these assembled with a certain order? And many people who are too young may not remember this, but we used to listen to a music album that from start to finish, and it had a thread, a narrative, if you will, that was sort of devised in the order of the songs, sometimes the nature and the subject of the songs. Even though these works are pulled from afar, is this assembled together with a narrative in mind?
Yes, it is. And I'm glad you asked that, because when I'm writing a poem, I'm just writing that poem. But as we got a chance to talk about, a new poem always comes into being in response to what I've done before. And I'm always thinking of what is the next thing I can do that will push a certain line of inquiry or a way of looking at the world, or a certain way of speaking in just a little bit farther in new directions, to simultaneously maintain what I've done and but extend its terrain a little bit. And so all of my books have had a theme, some more, some less subtle. This one, I think, on the whole, is more subtle, but for a reason. I wanted to my heroes are the great American and English poets of the middle of the 20th century, the ones who were born after the First World War, who often fought in the Second World War, and came back from that war and its devastation, and tried to rebuild the culture using that weakest of instrument, the human language, the English language. So Richard Wilbur, whom I mentioned earlier, Anthony Hecht, Philip Larkin, whom I also mentioned, are among them. Helen Pinkerton and J.V. Cunningham and Edgar Bowers. All these wonderful poets, some of whom were religious, some of whom were not. Robert Lowell, for instance, was a Catholic convert. What they did in their books in the about the decade and a half after the Second World War was to write beautifully constructed lyric poems that stood on their own, and their books tended to be studies in formal perfection that usually didn't have too much of a larger theme looming up. Each individual poem was allowed to just be its own self, and that constituted the collection. There are definitely exceptions to that, there'd be slight connections. So I wanted St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, in a sense, to be a tribute. You talk about albums. This is the tribute album, I guess, but
Yeah.
A kind of tribute to that sense of craftsmanship and formal perfection. And so it may not be a thematic unity, but one of the goals was to make sure each of these poems was especially well polished, was especially well made, in honor of the kind of craft tradition that I saw in these great masters. But as I mentioned, they fought in the Second World War, and so a second theme I wanted was to have a series of poems in this volume that that represent, frankly, the devastations of human evil in the Second World War, in my poem "Waking in Dresden," in the sex abuse scandals in the church. So, from the Diaries of Maria Monk is a sort of gauntlet thrown down on that subject, and then also to recognize that no evil is ever uniquely modern. And so, "The Death of Cicero" was a poem that was the last poem I wrote for this book, and that was to anchor the poem in visions of what human civilization at its worst has been, and then to counter that with Thomas Aquinas, who in the title poem prays for this wounded world, even as he's also preaching about its brilliance, its beauty, and its intelligibility. And all of the other poems are intended within that matrix of formal perfection, grappling with evil, and entering into the mystery, especially the sacred mystery of God's act of creation and its summoning us to our salvation. All of the poems are different essays and exploration of those three themes, sometimes together, sometimes separately.
What I love. I can't read or learn enough about World War II, and I love the fact that figures into your admiration for the poets of the mid 20th century, and I love it because it seems to be what you seem to be saying is they were formed by this. They were formed by this world catastrophe, and it's interesting because I interviewed not that long, about a year ago. I interviewed the author of the book "The Women Are Up to Something," which is all about kind of the Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Mary Midgley and Iris Murdoch, and the philosophical tradition, the transformation of philosophy by these four women in England in the 20th century. And the start of the book, I think it's Mary Midgley who's sitting with her mentor, or maybe it's Philippa Foot, whichever, in a movie theater watching the newsreels showing not live footage, but recorded footage of bodies being pushed by bulldozers into open pits as the concentration camps have been revealed for the world, and so on and so forth. And for this young female philosopher walking out and talking to her mentor and saying, everything is different now. Everything has changed now. And how philosophy can't be a parlor game. It has to wrestle with these profoundly, not that it was ever meant to be a parlor game, but it sort of devolved to a parlor game where simple questions were very meticulously tied with a bow, and that's where you left it. As opposed to having to grapple with the darkness that is human nature, and also the lightness that is the God kiss that we have. And to my understanding, so it seems there is this poetic reflection on the darkness that we find in human nature, and the God kiss that we also have, that you admire so much in these poets. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh yes, that's what I was trying to do. You got it.
Yeah, no, it's wonderfully so. I wanted to see if we could. I have a poem I'd love to have you read, but I want to give you the chance. Is there a poem that you would mind pulling out, one in particular that moves you at this moment from this collection that you'd like to read for us?
Well, how about Cracks?
Great.
This is given what we were just talking about. Here's a poem that addresses both those things simultaneously. It's in three parts in rhyming iambic pentameter quatrains for those of you who are keeping score at home. Cracks. 1. The heads of maples, filling in above, she sets out on her daylight wanderings. Some tarnished penny stored in one old glove she grips to feel its weight as her arm swings. A jealous grip, perhaps, and yet she's skipping and humming notes that spread beyond all tune. Her dress like floating clouds through green fields, slipping, and eyes as brightened as the summer moon. Along her way, she stops, from time to time, to draw a penny from its woolen sack, as if to plant the earth with what's sublime, she'll press it down within a sidewalk crack. 2. The guests expected, and the kitchen warm with ham and bubbling green bean casserole, the woman turned and, taking up his arm, reminded him the table would be full. She pressed the near end firmly to her side, while he took hold and pulled upon the far, to spread the surface outward on its slide and make room for the leaf with inlaid star. But as the cherry top was drawn apart, they saw the grime of ancient applesauce and other seeping things whose cunning art had hid their mouldering as a grove does moss. 3. All fissures that run through are sunlit visions, all chips in polished marble, nicks in paint, all hints our logic covers up elisions, and every perfect surface is a feint. All places out of reach beneath the stove where ballpoint pens or uncooked rice have rolled, each pause in speech that opens like a cove between the easily said and the untold. All darkness that's as painful as the light, to see and not see with the pulsing eye. We feel your presence beyond our sight, and hear your breath beneath the May wind's cry.
Wonderful. James, tell us a little bit about the genesis of that poem.
So the first part actually is an image taken from Annie Dillard's The Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, where Dillard describes planting the earth with pennies, putting pennies in a sidewalk crack when she was a little girl as a way of expressing same thing I'm trying to express here, the superabundant mystery that's to be found in things.
Yeah.
But then there's the inevitable turn, and boy, the first time I experienced this, it was a revelation, and not in a good way, of pulling the dining room table apart to put in a leaf and discovering what your kids have managed to insert into that cracked space in their slobbering gobbler of all things phase when you sit still in the high chair. And it must be added, this was one of the last poems I wrote as we were packing up our house in Pennsylvania to move home to Michigan, and so I had just seen such a crack. And then in its third part, that long litany of lost things or cracked things. It ends up being a grammatical sentence, but you've got 10 lines before you get a verb.
Oh, wow.
It's just a long litany, and I wanted it to be a litany. I wanted this to end in a kind of prayer to those cracks in reality where either sometimes the darkness, but oftentimes the light suddenly can shine through.
God, that's good. That's so good. James, is it a would you call, and as we wind down, a last question or two, would you call the act of penning a poem, is it a prayerful act for you? Is there a God connectedness? Is there are you offering up a prayer for the intercession of a favorite saint on making making the meter right on this, or the intent right on this? How does prayer dovetail with poetry in your world?
Well, I suppose it dovetails in a number of ways, because as I got to mention earlier, sometimes I will come out of prayer and go into writing, and in a directly causal way. The kind of activity that is writing a poem is very similar to prayer in a number of ways. First of all, because there's so much give and take. There's receptivity, but also offering occurring. And it has something in common with prayer in another way, and that is in the act of making. It's just as in prayer, especially prayer in the liturgy. In a very literal sense, we're out of time during the liturgy. We're being pulled into eternity, and those, the stained glass with the sunlight coming in is a symbolic expression of what the liturgy is really doing, which is allowing eternity to enter into time. And writing a poem makes that experience a palpable experience, you might say, because 4 hours could go by and I wouldn't have even moved except for looking at except for the act of writing. It just time. My kids have, grown wearily used to this, where, Dad suddenly got an idea for a poem just as we were about to sit down and read Little House on the Prairie. Yeah. Dad, you coming? Just 5 more minutes, I'll say. And 2 hours goes by. And that the timelessness of it is for me, to my mind, it's just a sublime experience, because it is a stepping out of the clockwork of the world and into just this other place. And I learned so much from it. It's definitely the place where I feel most fully alive.
Hmm. Last question for you, James. How has poetry changed you, and how do you feel it could change those of us who are reading your works and the works of some of these greats you've introduced us to?
So I think all of our human activities have to be schools for eternity. And that goes from the cracking of black walnuts or the selling of insurance. There, as John Paul II told us, there has to be a contemplative dimension in any properly human work if it's going to be salutary for man. And the genius of work is in man, he says in Laborum Exercens. And then in an early poem he wrote about work called The Quarry. What's lovely about works of fine art is they're works of human hands. They're works of activity. They're works of activity, though, that seem in two ways to participate in stillness. First of all, the silence, the thought, the contemplation that goes into their making, but also because they are as objects that are made for no other reason than to manifest being, to be something, and to draw us into the depths of being. They are themselves their own kind of preparation for the life of prayer and the contemplation of God, to which we're ultimately called here and now, but also as our true and final end. And I think it's important that we recognize that our lives in this world and the culture that we inhabit are the product of those different contemplative acts we perform. The contemplative act of the man at work who thinks about what he's doing, who's a thoughtful craftsman, a thoughtful gardener, thoughtful exterminator. And it's the privilege of the fine arts that, because they are, in one manner of speaking, an end in themselves, that they can resemble our final calling in a way, to a greater extent than so many of our other activities. And so when you read good literature, on the one hand, you're getting the news. You're hearing about human experience and activities, all that torn asunder stuff that we talked about from the book of Genesis. But you're contemplating all that from a position of leisure, of rest. And in that respect, it's a way of learning. It's a way of entering more deeply into the truth about being. And it's a way of the soul rising from being as in the stuff of this world to being itself, who is God. It's not prayer. It's not a substitute for prayer, but it's a kind of training ground that stands in a certain relationship to it.
James Matthew Wilson, Catholic, professor, eminent poet, and author of his collected works, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Thanks, Todd.
So I've been thinking, once upon a time, G.K. Chesterton mused, quote, "Poets are commonly spoken of as psychologically unreliable," close quote. They aren't reasonable, he seemed to say. After all, the impracticality of existing as the stereotypical poet, that is, a simple, disheveled figure haunted by elusive verse and donning a permanent faraway gaze, seems most apparent to the rest of the practical world. We, after all, sensibly set our alarms, shave our careworn morning visages, and respectably tromp off to work in suits, steadily eyeing a distant retirement. A retirement, I might add, where we might paradoxically enjoy being simple, disheveled figures, haunted by elusive verse, and donning our own faraway gazes. But Chesterton said something that corrected this worldly misunderstanding. Quote, "Poetry is sane because it floats easily in an infinite sea. Reason seeks to cross the infinite sea and so make it finite. The result is mental exhaustion. To accept everything is an exercise, to understand everything a strain. The poet only desires exaltation and expansion, a world to stretch himself in. The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. It is a logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head, and it is his head that splits." Close quote. It strikes me that James Matthew Wilson would agree with the great Chesterton. The true poet, James seems to say in our conversation, is someone who maintains an honest sense of proportionality. That is, unity in the midst of multiplicity, enduring tradition rendered alive by fresh style, sparkling metaphor animating reality with new meaning, and the grittiness of our earthbound nature wedded with our transcendence as children of God. Surely this poetic search for proportionality is suffused with a vexing push and pull tension, but it is something that we can recognize as an authentic tension, for it is forever playing out in our own world and within our own souls. It is a tension that comports with reality. It is reasonable. What is unreasonable, however, is when certain decadent poets pervert this tension instead of reckoning with it. They settle for wild imbalance to shock and upend. In so doing, these figures violate human nature, divert it to something that is decidedly not transcendent, and in consequence, sour the culture. Not long ago, I remember reading a book on existentialism, which described how the far end of a failed ideology is decadence, and decadence is the last cry before nihilism. The nihilist sees man through an unpleasing gray monochrome as a foul ape serving only his appetites in a godless universe. That lens shapes everything the nihilist sees. As Chesterton says, quote, "He is in the clean, well-lit prison of one idea. He is sharpened to one painful point. He is without healthy hesitation and healthy complexity," close quote. Nihilism is hopeless and unreasonable, but good poetry seeks its correction. To be sure, Chesterton was right. The true poet does only desire exaltation and expansion. The true poet only does ask to get his head into the heavens. Poetry bursts brilliantly from the sacred meeting of creature and creator, at the touch point between two straining fingers in Michelangelo's fresco, The Creation of Adam. Grit and glory emerge reasonably where God and his well-loved child meet. It happens amidst the earthy and the sublime, brokenness and promise. Poetry isn't necessarily easy. It won't always soothe and comfort. But done right, poetry always edifies. And this is as it should be, honest, true, and infinitely reasonable. And one last thing. Be sure to read James Matthew Wilson's St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, but also pick up G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy and dive into the second chapter called The Maniac, where the Prince of Paradox explores the themes I referred to about the poet and the logician in greater depth. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.